Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Historical Markers. This episode's a little different. We've been doing markers all across Illinois and into Kentucky for a long time now, and as we've gone back and we've looked at the records from those counties, we've noticed that some new monuments have been added, and so we're just going to retrace our steps some and add those markers to what we've got so that you too can enjoy the history of the places we live. So stay tuned with me. All right, we are in Prairie du Rocher, Illinois, in Randolph County, and they have had their big 300-year celebration, and they have added a ton of new markers. So we are here today to cover those. This is on the grounds, if you go far enough down to the Creole House. It's all along this black fence here, and they have markers. It's a timeline, and so we're going to read these markers in order. And I, of course, from being from Southern Illinois, this is called Prairie du Rocher. But I have a feeling that back in the day where we started, when it was first established, it was Prairie du Rocher, since it was the French who settled this. So at some point it got Southern Illinois-ized. I don't know how that happened, and I would be interested in that story. But let's start with this timeline and this history. It is fascinating. All right, 1722, village of Prairie du Rocher, or Prairie du Rocher, is formed. In 1722, as part of the old French colony that developed in the Mississippi Valley, a tract of land donated by the Royal Indies Company was settled as Prairie du Rocher. The motivation for this settlement was agriculture, mining, and a home for settlers, meaning many being new arrivals from France. The population of the area was 126, not counting 77 slaves. 59 of those were black and 17 Indian. Historical relevance. 1720. The first Fort de Chartres was built to protect and develop France's holdings here, which held great promise for economic opportunity. 1731. Ben Franklin establishes the first public library. 1734. Nevois Maillard House was built. Forgive me on these names. French is not anywhere in my wheelhouse. So, this house was built and it still stands near St. Joseph's Cemetery. To this day, 1722, La Guiane is celebrated. The tradition, which remains unbroken 300 years later, and this was in 2022, when this celebration was held. During New Year's Eve, members of La Guiane, wearing 18th century attire, carol from door to door, performing the French folk begging song, La Guiane. I'm sure somebody will correct me on the pronunciation, please. Besides providing for local consumption, Prairie du Rocher shipped approximately 400,000 livres of wheat to the New Orleans and Louisiana country. About 247 producing farms with approximately 2,250 acres cultivated in wheat in the area at that time. The origin of old world style agriculture in the Midwest started here in Prairie du Rocher. New Orleans is only 4 years older than Prairie du Rocher. 1743, common grounds established in Prairie du Rocher. The common field system was a practice that French settlers brought with them that still has a lasting effect today. It was an agricultural system that consisted of farmland and pasture for animals that was communally owned by the village. Inhabitants had to mutually agree upon restrictions such as when to let the animals graze and when to take in the crops. The size of the portion of common fields assigned to each villager was dependent upon the size of his family. The common grounds exist to this day. Historical relevance. 1734. St. Anne's Church was built near Fort de Chartres. 1735. St. Genevieve was founded by the settlers from Illinois country. 1753. Ben Franklin invented the lightning rod. 1754. Soldiers from Fort de Chartres joined French forces to capture George Washington and his troops in Pittsburgh. Oh, here we go. The French words. Coutume de Paris. That sounds horrible. Coutume de Paris, le Code Noir. Women and free blacks had the same rights and responsibilities as other French inhabitants. They were allowed to own land and carry on trade for themselves. If a woman remarried after becoming widowed, the second husband had no right to her estate if the second marriage ended in divorce. By 1849, all blacks in Prairie du Rocher were free, years before the Civil War. Common grounds is the first evidence of self-government by the inhabitants of Prairie du Rocher. To this day, the profits from the common grounds helps to fund the Prairie du Rocher School. Since cooperation was essential in making the common field system sustainable, this system lent itself to less violence and a tendency to settle disagreements. 1763, the Treaty of Paris affects Prairie du Rocher. The end of the 7 Years' War, better known to the colonists as the French and Indian War, came not by skirmish, but by the Treaty of Paris signed February 1763. Through this, all of France's possessions east of the Mississippi were ceded to Britain, with the exception of New Orleans. France's rule on the Mississippi had ended, and the inhabitants of Prairie du Rocher were faced with an uncertain future. The French and Indians were allies, and for the most part friendly. Historical relevance. 1756. The fourth Fort de Chartres, made primarily of stone, was substantially completed. 1756, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart was born. 1764, Pierre Leclerc and Auguste Chanteau leave Prairie du Rocher to establish a trading post which becomes St. Louis. 1765, the first St. Joseph's Church builds near the cemetery. The Treaty of Paris did contain clauses important to the inhabitants of Prairie du Rocher. They were allowed to practice the Roman Catholic religion. They were confirmed in their land holdings. They were permitted to take their goods and move freely to the other side of the river or elsewhere if desired. Though the Illinois country and Louisiana were viewed by France as a drain to finances and readily disposable, the Illinois country was called upon to provide wheat and supplies for the troops on both continents. The treaty was announced on the church doorsteps after Mass. 1765, living under British rule. The British are coming had a much different meaning to the villagers of Prairie du Rocher. The British took control of Fort de Chartres, renaming it Fort Cavendish on October 10, 1765. The majority of the residents of the villages of Chartres, St. Philippe, and Kaskaskia left for the West Bank. Very few villagers left Prairie du Rocher, and those staying were asked to take an oath. They were given until March 1766 to decide. The fort would continue under British rule for 7 years. Historic relevance. 1764, Mozart composes the First Symphony. 1767, records and sacred vessels are moved from St. Anne's to St. Joseph's in Prairie du Rocher. 1769, Napoleon Bonaparte is born. 1770, Beethoven was born. 1772, flood drives British out of the fort, leaving the fort abandoned for good. Changing, unchanging. Changing, due to the loss of the Jesuit priest and the population of neighboring Chartres having only 2 male inhabitants, and St. Philippe 4, St. Joseph as Prairie du Rocher was the sole remaining parish. Unchanging, on a local level, the British left in place the captains of militia who, under the French regime, had the ability to try petty cases and to put into execution decrees given by the commandant. Under British rule, these duties continued. The British had been the enemy and the villagers' trade competitor for years. Also, England was anti-Catholic, although a provision in the Treaty of Paris allowed the French to keep their religion. There must have been some great apprehension in the population. How many years would you live under an enemy flag? 1778, third flag to fly over Prairie du Rocher. George Rogers Clark, under secret orders from Patrick Henry, the governor of Virginia, was sent to take the Illinois villages. This would give more protection to the eastern colonies from British attack. For the record, the Prairie du Rocher inhabitants were not so much supporters of the Americans as opposed to the British. The terms of liberty and justice made it easy for the occupants of Prairie du Rocher to come to terms with the Americans. Historic relevance. 1773, Boston Tea Party. 1775, American Revolution begins. 1776, the Declaration of Independence. 1778, George Rogers Clark captures Fort Kaskaskia for America. 1779, residents of Prairie du Rocher elect 2 magistrates. First official government. Spirit of optimism. The villagers assisted the Virginians with food and clothes and welcomed them socially. Their spirits were high now that they were rid of the hated British, and because of the American alliance with France, their hopes were that they could return to the rule of the French king. George Rogers Clark rapidly realized the French were not hostiles. Their concerns lay in the assurance of religious freedom and the promise to set up courts, which he put to case. Thus he was greeted with enthusiasm. George Rogers Clark attended a ball held in his honor in Prairie du Rocher. 1818, changes in government, local and state. The formation of Randolph County in 1795 preceded Illinois statehood by 23 years. By act of the state legislature in 1821, the settlement of Prairie du Rocher became an official village within the state of Illinois. Trustees were appointed for the village. Such a small village did not need 2 layers of government, and the common field organization was closer to what the inhabitants had been accustomed to and met their legal needs. The village organization was renewed in 1837 when the previous one had lapsed. Historical relevance. 1787, United States Constitution is adopted. 1789, French Revolution begins. Marie Antoinette was beheaded 4 years later. 1790, first bicycle was invented. Benjamin Franklin dies. 1794, the cotton gin was invented. 1796, smallpox vaccine was developed. 1803, Lewis and Clark passed the ruins of Fort de Chartres prior to starting their expedition. Napoleon signs the Louisiana Territory Treaty. 1807, Fulton builds the first steamboat. 1811, New Madrid earthquake, death toll 1,000 plus. 1818, Henry Connor becomes Randolph County Sheriff. 1820, the Creole House was built. Randolph County's property identification is unique due to the French arpent system, which was laid out prior to the formation of the county. Due to the system already in place, a dual property identification number was given to be able to reconcile the plotted arpents to the state of Illinois' adopted metes and bounds. An arpent is 3,420 square meters, about 1 acre. Prairie du Rocher predates the state of Illinois by 96 years and the USA by 54. 1864, U.S. Civil War skirmish in Prairie du Rocher. A minor skirmish in the U.S. Civil War actually occurred when a group of bushwhackers and desperados, I love that, came to Prairie du Rocher. 2 guerrillas, not the monkey kind, were killed by Union soldiers and the others were captured. The subsequent actions of the soldiers in the village were to rob blast stores of goods and steal horses from 3 inhabitants. The Union captain denied any wrongdoing, claiming that people in town were Confederate sympathizers. The U.S. Civil War ends in 1865. Historical relevance. 1835, William Henry plats Prairie du Rocher's migration to higher ground. 1836, Battle of the Alamo. 1837, Chicago becomes a city. 1839, Antoine Blythe established trade and barter store, predecessor of Connor's store, still standing. 1844, Great Flood covers part of St. Joseph Cemetery. 1846, planet Neptune was discovered. 1849, California Gold Rush. Antoine Blythe and several other residents head west. 1855, St. Joseph's Parochial School was built. 1858, current St. Joseph's Brick Church built. 1861, U.S. Civil War begins. 1863, 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. 1865, Abraham Lincoln is assassinated. By 1864, villagers had lived through the Fox War, the French and Indian War, the American Revolution, the War of 1812, and the Civil War, along with Indian attacks and skirmishes, each with its own repercussions. During the Civil War, travel from Missouri to Illinois required permission. How many wars have been fought on American soil since you have been born? 1867, Abraham Lee from Prairie du Rocher wins lottery. In Chicago, Mr. Uranus H. Crosby built an elaborate opera house and ran out of money. He raffled off the property, and Abraham Lee of Prairie du Rocher was the winner. It took weeks for Mr. Lee to hear of his winnings, and then another month to claim it. Having no need for an opera house, Lee sold his ticket back for $200,000, a very substantial amount in that day. Lee then built a 3-story mansion on the property where this plaque stands. Historical relevance. 1867, yellow fever kills 3,000 in New Orleans. Alfred Nobel patents dynamite. 1871, Great Chicago Fire. 1872, Connor's store is built. 1873, Prairie du Rocher government reorganizes, incorporates. 1878, Negro School opens in Prairie du Rocher. 1880, church bell tower constructed. Now here's a picture of the Lee Mansion. It would have stood right out here on this property. So there it is. It says the Lee Mansion. With his winnings, Abraham Lee built a 3-story Second Empire style mansion with a mansard roof, ornate bracketed eaves, stained glass windows, and an enclosed front sun porch facing Market Street on this lot. The foundation remains are directly in front of you, and the remaining building is the summer kitchen wash house. A.H. Lee made a good decision as the Opera House burned in the Chicago Fire. 1889, first phantom funeral sighting documented. It was a hot July 4th night in Prairie du Rocher. Mrs. Chris and her neighbor were sitting on the front porch around midnight when the two spotted an entourage coming from the old fort. It was apparently a funeral procession, and though wagons and pairs of horsemen followed by mourners on foot stirred up clouds of dust, none of them made any sound at all. The only sound was the breeze rustling through the trees and the incessant barking of the Chris's family dog. The procession passed by and faded away in the darkness. The dog's bark woke the neighbor's husband, who, upon rising the next morning, verified the women's account. Historical relevance. 1880, population of Prairie du Rocher is 1,185 in the census. 1885, St. Joseph's Parish builds 2-story brick school. Daimler patents the first true motorcycle. 1887, the Eiffel Tower construction begins in Paris. 1893, A.L. Brands from Prairie du Rocher is elected state senator. 1895, Marconi sends first radio signal. 1897, telephone service is extended to Prairie du Rocher. 125 years in ringing. On February 1st, 1897, Harrisonville Telephone Company was granted the rights to extend the first telephone service to Prairie du Rocher and continues to this day to be the only provider of landline communication to the village. An innovative company, it has increased its services to the residents, offering internet and television in addition to telephone. Few companies can boast of this longevity, and that was in 2022. Numerous stories abound as to what was the reason for this funeral and its reoccurrence. Most stories agree and are set in 1765 at the fort, but then vary from that point. Most believe it was an altercation between two men, either officers or gentlemen or both. Some believe there may have been a woman involved or discretion needed. One thing is for sure, if you speak with many witnesses, there are personal stories of their experiences to be heard. Perhaps you too could be a witness to this chilling tale. The funeral is said to be still seen when July 4th falls on a Friday and the moon is bright. In 1902, railroad granted easement. In 1902, Iron Mountain Railroad laid a single track through Prairie du Rocher, which provided passenger service to St. Louis daily. Far from backwards, Prairie du Rocher was as modern and up-to-date as other larger communities, and the passenger train would connect the village to outside goods and travel and open an avenue for visitors to come and appreciate the rich French and by now diverse culture of the village. Historical relevance. 1903, Harley-Davidson was founded. 1904, World's Fair held in St. Louis. 1905, Prairie du Rocher Democrat newspaper began publication. 1906, State Bank of Prairie du Rocher established. W.H. Connor House built on Main Street changes the traffic flow of Prairie du Rocher permanently. 1909, the NAACP is formed. 1911, the first automobile is driven in Prairie du Rocher. 1913, the state of Illinois takes ownership of Fort de Chartres. Constance Connor becomes Prairie du Rocher's first female voter. 1914, World War I begins. First water plant built for Prairie du Rocher. 1916, first electrical plant in operation in village. The railroad easement required a modification in the old road, the King's Highway from Fort de Chartres, as it cut off passage from the cemetery to the Bluff Road. Through the years, the railroad has increased its use of the easement, with now 2 tracks being used heavily to move freight out of St. Louis to the south. It has been commented on by visitors to this village. They move the world through Prairie du Rocher. 1916, Fort de Chartres becomes a state park. As the state of Illinois' second state park, Fort de Chartres restoration began with the gunpowder magazine in 1917. The state had taken ownership of the grounds in 1913. Further restorative efforts followed through the 1920s by uncovering the foundation. In the late 1920s and throughout the 1930s, the USWPA rebuilt the land gate entrance and the 2 currently standing stone buildings. The fort's current economic impact is an attraction that brings 50,000 annual visitors to this area, with an estimate of $6,350,000, and that was the 2022 figure. Historical relevance. 1918, Spanish flu epidemic kills 20 to 50 million worldwide. 1919, road built from Prairie du Rocher to the fort. 1920, prohibition begins, no local impact noticed. 2-year high school begins on St. Joseph's campus. 1921, Prairie du Rocher Sun newspaper begins publication. 1927, Charles Lindbergh flies across the Atlantic Ocean. Babe Ruth hits 60 home runs. 1929, the stock market crashes. 1930, Great Depression begins. 1932, airport built and opens south of the town. Community merchants create wheat script in effort to help farmers in highest point of depression. 1933, C.J. Cribbs is elected Illinois State Senator, and A.A. Brands is elected to the Illinois House. 1939, Wizard of Oz shown in the theater. Columbia Quarry starts mining the bluffs nearby. In 1929, Illinois State Route 155 opened to traffic after 4 years of construction. The increase in visitors to the fort and the necessity of travel between the neighboring town of Ruma, Illinois, gave credence to the need to build the hard road. Many travel this 10.81-mile stretch to visit the now designated French Historic Corridor. The Gunpowder Magazine is the oldest building in the state of Illinois. 1951, Archaeological dig unearths archaic artifacts. The Modoc Rock Shelter was discovered in 1951 by archaeologist Irvin Pythman. As a result of road grading, Pythman observed artifacts on the surface under or near the bluff at the site on Bluff Road. This spurred major excavations in the 1950s and 1980s, mostly led by the Illinois State Museum. Artifacts revealed that 9,000 years ago, this rock shelter was used as a short-term camp. By 6,000 years ago, it was used as a long-term camp, and then again for a hunting camp 4,000 years ago. Historical relevance. 1948, the WPA installs water lines to homes in village. 1941, Japan bombs Pearl Harbor. U.S. enters World War II. 1946, Prairie Theater opens with Blue Dahlia premiere. 1948, construction begins of 16.5-mile levee system. 1951, St. Joseph's Parish builds current brick school, which is leased to the public school district. 1955, Salk's polio vaccine is given throughout the U.S. 1956, First Baptist Church of Prairie du Rocher was organized. 1957, school gymnasium was completed. 1958, the interstate highway system begins. 1963, John F. Kennedy assassinated. 1968, Martin Luther King assassinated. 1969, Neil Armstrong walks on the moon. Though this area is best known for its French founding and the rich agriculture, it is now certain that our bluffs have been providing shelter for 9,000 plus years. Evidence has shown that during their occupation, the inhabitants had a diet of deer, raccoon, possum, birds, and fish. These earlier settlers, too, thought it was a perfect place to call home. Deposits are first stratified Archaic deposits found in eastern North America. Lee-Brickey mansion destroyed. Abraham Lee, after winning the Opera House lottery, built the mansion on these grounds. A.H. Lee died 2 years after the completion of this magnificent home. Lee's business partner, F.W. Brickey, bought the home, and since that time it has been known as the Brickey House. On April 5, 1970, the fire was discovered at 2:45 a.m. when already out of control. The Prairie du Rocher Fire Department, along with neighboring departments, saw the last of the frame structure fall about 3:45 a.m. Historic relevance. 1970, first rendezvous is held at Fort de Chartres. Creole House bequeathed to Randolph County Historical Society. 1971, St. Joseph celebrates 250th anniversary. 1973, the mobile phone is invented. 1976, United States celebrates its bicentennial, 200. 1976, Village Hall Post Office Fire Station is built. 1980, John Lennon is shot. 1981, MTV is launched. Local historian Percy Clark dies in a house fire. 1983, economy starts to rebound from recession. 1986, State Bank builds a new building. 1987, Prairie du Rocher Hawks baseball team wins state championship. The Berlin Wall is torn down. The Lee-Brickey mansion sat vacant for years according to Brickey's wishes. Many admired it from afar, yet never saw its true extravagance. As fate would have it, the Chicago Opera House, the subject of the lottery winnings, which were used to build this opulent mansion by A.H. Lee, would burn in the Chicago fire on October 10, 1871. This mansion suffered the same consequence almost 100 years later. 1993, Prairie du Rocher spared. The year was one of devastating floods all over the Midwest. Prairie du Rocher's fight to save their precious town came to a precipice when a local construction company blew out a section of the river levee, thus saving the town. The homes located outside the creek levee were lost. Help in prevention and cleanup was received by local and national communities, along with the residents' tireless efforts. The 1993 flood was labeled a 500-year flood. Historical relevance. 1990, launch of the Hubble telescope. 1993, Valmeyer, Illinois is destroyed in the flood. French Heritage Relief Fund was established. First text message was sent on a Nokia phone. 1996, Internet comes to Prairie du Rocher. 1997, first Harry Potter book is published. 1998, Google begins. 2000, Y2K concerns abound. 2001, attack on the World Trade Center. 2004, Facebook is launched. 2005, Prairie du Rocher Library opens. Hurricane Katrina devastates New Orleans, Louisiana. 2008, Prairie du Rocher Chamber of Commerce is formed. Flooding has been a part of inhabitants' lives since the village's founding. Significant flooding occurred in 1772, 1785, 1844, and most recently in 2019. Efforts still continue through the levee district to ensure safety of the residents of this region. A levee steering committee was formed and a strategic plan was established to further address the threat of flood. One benefit of a flood, in 1722, the flood forced the British out of the fort. 2002, 300 years of tradition. A strong suit of the village continues to be the respect and reverence to their traditions, both young and old. From the King's Ball, better known as the 12th Night Ball, held every year on the first Saturday of January, to the party in the park held on Wednesday evenings during the summer. Many love to gather and visit with each other to reminisce of times gone by. Many obstacles this community faces continue to be overcome with tenacity, kindness, and acceptance. Historical relevance. 2010, Apple releases the iPad. 2016, Levee Fest held to raise funds for levee study. Mother Teresa achieves sainthood. 2017, solar eclipse brings many visitors to the village. 2018, FEMA changes floodplain designation. 2019, levee holds for 6 months as floodwaters threaten. St. Louis Blues win the Stanley Cup. 2020, Fort de Chartres celebrates 300-year anniversary. The coronavirus shuts down the country. 2021, St. Rosa's Parish celebrates the tricentennial. 2022, Prairie du Rocher celebrates its 300-year anniversary with many events throughout the year. Russia invades Ukraine. The first African-American woman, Supreme Court Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, sworn in. As the world sees ever-changing climates, cultures, and challenges facing all that walk this earth, we hope that this timeline serves as a reminder to one and all, be you local or from afar, that the human spirit is alive and well. Whether you focus on the past, present, or future, acceptance and love will help all prevail. We all find it much more enjoyable with these attributes sprinkled in. The signs were gifted to the village on July 10th, 2022, as part of the tricentennial celebration. Well, guys, you've found the end of one of our episodes that we've done to catch up on new markers or markers we've missed in various counties we have already done historical markers in. So, yep, there might have been more than one county in this episode. You might have caught that. I've tried to tell you what county we're in every time we do filming when we're going back. We have found some absolutely amazing, fascinating stuff, and it's still out there. So stay with us as we continue to find historical markers and teach you a little bit about the history of the area we live in.